Can Christian doctrine and critical race theory be put into a healthy and productive conversation with each other as opposed to acrimonious debate? Well, Robert Romero and Jeff Liou certainly think so. Let me tell you what I thought of their new book.
Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz.
All right, I just finished an advanced copy of this new book from Baker Academic and Robert Chao Romero and Jeff Liou. Thank you to Baker for sending me this. It's called Christianity and Critical Race Theory. So let me take you through my almost typical format. I'm going to do something a little bit different in this video, but I do want to talk about what I typically talk about is the main idea, the research, and the readability of the book. And then I'm going to go on a slight excursus, a slight tangent, you might say, about this broader topic of critical race theory. And then I'm going to come back at the end to ultimately my reaction to this book specifically. So almost my typical format with a little bit of an excursus thrown there in the middle, but that's what I want to talk about. So first of all, the main idea of this book is that this book is coming from, the reader should know, a largely positive perspective on the body of academic work known kind of popularly as critical race theory, or CRT in some circles. So this is not a book that is trying to kind of slam dunk undermine critical race theory. It's trying to look with a positive and sympathetic and thoughtful and academic kind of view at critical race theory, and particularly see if there are any points of resonance or at least points of overlap between kind of historic Christian doctrine and ideas within critical race theory. If they might use very different language for some of the same ideas, but the authors are trying to explore these two really broad areas of thought and see if there are any kind of bridges between them, ways that the two things can be put into healthy conversation with each other, as opposed to a lot of the fighting and kind of toxic and polarizing dialogues. Well, I wouldn't even necessarily call them dialogues, but arguments that happen around the topic of critical race theory and Christianity today. So that's the main, and the main idea of the book is essentially that the premise of the book is that yes, these things can be put into good conversation with each other. So that's almost kind of a given. And then the authors try to dive deep and explore a little bit about what are those points of contact, what are things that the thoughtful Christian can appreciate about critical race theory, and vice versa. Can the person who is really learned in critical race theory appreciate about Christian doctrine? So that's the main idea of the book, Christianity and Critical Race Theory. It's a very apt title. Now, quickly, I'm going to talk about the research a little bit and the readability of the book before I go into my excursus. The research in this book is basically what you'd anticipate. In particular, the two authors seem to be quite well versed in critical race theory literature, more so than I am. I've read a decent amount, but they're much more so than I am. Especially, it seems like Robert Chao Romero was at one point a practicing attorney, is very, very immersed in the field of kind of legal studies. And as critical race theory is a subset of academic law, he is very well versed in primary text readings in the field of critical race theory, from what it seems in the book, especially. I will say on the research front, the first chapter or two, I got a little worried that the writers were over-relying on Delgado and Stefanchik's book, which down here I have on this shelf is an Intro to Critical Race Theory, which is a totally fine book. I really appreciate this book as well. But I was a little worried they were maybe over-relying on it in terms of talking about critical race theory ideas, just because critical race theory is a very, very broad and diverse field, and I didn't think it necessarily was wise to rely too much on that particular text. However, my fears were very mild, and they were put to rest as you get more into the book. They really don't rely on that book too much past those first opening chapters. So if you're a reader and you're picking up on that, I had the same kind of reaction. But the research is solid. It's good. It does get into, on the Christian side of the kind of conversation, they pull, I would say, pretty widely, historically and ecumenically from Christian theology. So there's a great chapter, which I'll talk about at the end, about the doctrine of sin, and they pull on a really wide range of theological voices in that particular part of the argument. So it's I would say it's solid. It's a very short book, so there's no massive pages of footnotes. There's not a huge bibliography, but it is easy to find everything that they researched if you want to go into anything deeper. All right, so that's the research. The readability of it is, I already mentioned, it's very short. So the readability is very, very, very approachable, very high. The style is very easy to get into. If you read the book I just held up a minute ago, the Critical Race Theory Introduction, it's kind of more like that book stylistically than something like a journal article. It's very, very, I thought it was very easy to read. There's a good bit of anecdote and personal story and personal reflection, particularly in one chapter. One of the co-authors tells a lot of his own personal story, so stories like that always kind of bring the reader in. And it's actually not a very long book at all. So highly readable. I would not be put off by if you're not into academic books, I would not be put off by the fact that it's under Baker's academic line. Super, super approachable. They even have a glossary at the end that defines important terms within critical race theory concepts and stuff that they wrestle with throughout the book. So very, very, I would say, easy to read, even for the uninitiated person who hasn't read much about CRT at all. Okay, so I want to get through those points. Hopefully that's helpful. Now I want to go on a little bit of a, I don't necessarily think the word tangent is appropriate, but I want to do a little bit of an excursus before I circle back to my reaction to this book specifically. And the reason I want to do this is because I want to comment on the conversation as it is that's being waged between critical race theory, philosophy, Christianity, culture, the culture war. I basically want to talk about the culture war for a moment because I think it's very relevant to this book. So critical race theory is obviously a lightning rod topic. And I also want to say that if you have watched some of my videos, particularly some of my videos in which I've commented on some of these cultural issues, you'll know that I am quite critical, sharply critical of what I've kind of termed the pop CRT, like the trickle down kind of ideas that have been influenced by the academic movement within critical race theory. So think your especially Robin DiAngelo, think Ibram Kendi, think corporate trainings, think a lot of that stuff. I've been sharply critical of some of the simplistic ideologies that have kind of trickled down out of that stuff. So this is why I wanted to take a brief excursus on this, because I had a largely positive reaction to this book, even though I'm very critical of some of those popularized ideas. And so what I wanted to say in this excursus here is that this book engages directly with more of the academic ideas within the field of critical race theory. It does not engage with the popularized ideas. Again, people like Robin DiAngelo. There's one passing reference to Robin DiAngelo in this book, and that is to say, the authors say, and they rightly say this, they say that White Fragility is not a CRT text, and so they don't engage with it and don't deliberate on it. They actually never even mention Ibram Kendi, for example. And it's totally their prerogative to do that, and they are correct to do that in a strict technical sense, that those are not CRT texts. However, I also think that reveals a little bit of the difficulty in this broader conversation that we're having in our culture right now, which is to say that a lot of people who are very concerned about critical race theory are concerned about the popularized form of it, and then the people who want to defend critical race theory frequently defend the academic form of it. Both sides, in my view, both sides have points that are valid, but there is a certain talking past each other that can happen when you get trapped into critiquing the popularized form and then defending the academic form, and there seems to be an impasse there. And I would personally love to see a book, or lots of books probably actually, of this level of thoughtfulness and research and kind of conversancy in the academic ideas. I would love to see books of that thoughtful tone that deal with, in a fair way, some of the very real critiques and concerns of the more popular CRT ideas, as opposed to just saying, well, that's not CRT, I'm going to talk about actual CRT now. I hope that makes sense. This is the reason I wanted to emphasize this in this particular review, is because this book is not that book. It's not dealing with some of the concerns that people, quote unquote, on the ground have, people in like school boards and PTA meetings and all that stuff. It's not dealing with some of those popularized, like I said, popularized CRT ideas that people have very real concerns about. It's not dealing with that. So I want to emphasize that, because especially if you're watching my videos and you're coming from a place similar to me and some of the concerns I've had, don't come to this book with those expectations. What this book is, however, is a very thoughtful, well-researched, and engaging and readable discussion about actual critical race theory, the actual more academic, thoughtful stuff that's very interesting, and trying to bring those ideas into conversation with Christian doctrine. So I hope that makes sense. I felt like that was a really important thing to kind of put out there if you are thinking at all about reading this book. So now I do want to circle back, given all of that, even though I want the book I just described that I want to exist, maybe doesn't exist yet, or at least I'm not aware of it yet, and this book is not that book. I want to talk about what this book actually is and my reaction to what this book actually brings to the conversation, which is largely, in my opinion, is very largely positive. So, okay, here is my reaction to this particular book from Baker and from these co-authors. I liked this book. I found it helpful. I found it very thoughtful. There are a few things specifically that I liked about it, and what they do in this text to get a little bit more detailed is they structure it in what's maybe a typical systematic theology kind of framework. They talk about theological categories like creation, sin, redemption, and then consummation, or eschatology, the direction kind of all things. And so they take each of those topics, and then they kind of, under that topic, talk about classical Christian thought, and then they compare it to kind of what a critical race theory or critical race theorist scholar might say, even if they're using different terminology. So, for example, in the chapter on creation, they talk about the inherent goodness of creation, and then they talk about this concept known of like cultural wealth or community cultural wealth that comes out of certain CRT scholars. I thought that was really, really interesting and really helpful kind of point of kind of some common philosophical ideas there, that in every culture there can be found wealth, there can be found positive good things, as opposed to a cultural deficit mindset, which is to brand an entire cultural group as deficient. Instead of that, look for the wealth, look for what is kind of a sign of life and flourishing and goodness in that community. I really like that. There are two chapters in particular I really loved, which were the chapter on sin and then the chapter on consummation or eschatology. I thought the chapter on sin was absolutely fantastic, and relating it to the idea that in CRT thought or parlance, the idea that racism is kind of an ordinary experience, that it kind of is pervasive in human society. I mean, there is huge overlaps between that and the Christian notion of original sin, inescapable sin. The pervasiveness of sin in structures and institutions and people. I thought that chapter brought those two ideas into really, really wonderful dialogue, and there was an amazing couple pages that talk about the existence of kind of structural thought as it relates to sin in historic Christianity, which modern, particularly white evangelicals, tend to not be so conversant in the idea of systemic brokenness as systemic sin. But that chapter was a really fantastic defense of systemic sin from a historic Christian perspective. Really, really wonderful discussion. And then the chapter on eschatology, consummation, is where the authors get the most critical of critical race theory writ large. They're kind of the sharpest critiques in that final chapter on critical race theory, because rightly, I think they're correct that CRT really does not have an eschatological vision. It does not have a kind of a where are things going in the end, and what is that going to look like, and how is that going to be a hopeful, flourishing vision. Instead, it can kind of lapse into what they call discourses of death. I thought that was a really, really sharp and smart discussion. And it's good to see in this book. That's where they bring the most kind of critique to CRT to bear. It's good to see that in this book, because I think that will win over maybe some of the skeptical, potentially skeptical readers who might think that this is just a puff piece, just trying to only defend CRT and not be willing to be critical of it. And I share a lot of the same critiques that they brought to bear, and I thought they did a good job in bringing it into the kind of the Christian theology and Christian doctrine conversation. So this is some of my detailed thoughts on my reaction to this book. If you read this book, given its own parameters, which is to be a discussion and engagement with academic proper CRT concepts, not this popularized view, you'll find a lot of thoughtful stuff in here, and a lot of engaging story. I think if you're someone who I would say the reader who has already made up their mind, so to speak, about CRT probably isn't going to be swayed by this book. But the reader who is intrigued, who genuinely wants to learn more, or even wants to understand, like, what is this critical race theory thing that people keep batting around and getting so worked up about, and particularly if you're a Christian and you're fluent with some of these Christian concepts, I think that reader is going to find a lot of really helpful information and content here as an introduction to some interesting CRT ideas, and also a way to figure out kind of what is critical race theory trying to really do in terms of its actual academic kind of application. I have maybe a few more things that I would be slightly more critical about CRT than these writers, potentially, maybe, but I'm not even actually really sure because I found a lot of really helpful stuff here. And I think even if the book was maybe a little bit longer, some of those critiques could have been even a little bit more fleshed out. But as it is, I think that the authors accomplished really well what they were trying to do, which is to chart a healthy, productive kind of path of dialogue between the academic theories and historic Christian doctrine and try to find some points of resonance there in our kind of like really acrimonious cultural moment. So it's a book I would commend, honestly. It's a book I would commend, given all those caveats and given that whole excursus I went on. If you know what this book is and what it is not, I would encourage the interested reader to pick this one up. It's either out now or going to be out very soon as of the time that I record this in early April. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on Baker Academic's new book, Robert Chao Romero and Jeff Liou's co-authors, Christianity and Critical Race Theory. I hope that you found this helpful. As always, I appreciate you taking the time to watch.